Catherine's girls' boarding school was nestled in the rolling hills on the outskirts of Abuja, far enough from the bustling city to maintain an air of quiet serenity. By day, the school was a place of learning, discipline, and camaraderie. But by night, when the shadows lengthened and the winds whispered through the trees, it transformed into a place of whispered fears and ghostly tales. Among the many stories shared by the students, one legend reigned supreme, the tale of Miss Koi Koi. It was a story passed down through generations, told by older students to the younger ones during those late-night gatherings in the dormitories when the lights were out and the moon cast eerie shadows on the walls. The legend was always the same, yet it never failed to send shivers down the spines of those who heard it. "Did you hear that sound last night?" asked Ada, her voice barely above a whisper, as she gathered with her friends under the dim glow of a single bulb. "It was Miss Koi Koi. I'm sure of it." The other girls huddled closer, their eyes wide with fear. "Who is Miss Koi Koi?" asked Nika, the newest and youngest member of the group. She had heard the name mentioned several times but had yet to learn the full story. Ada leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "Miss Koi Koi was once a teacher here many years ago. They say she was very beautiful, but also very strict. She always wore these bright red high-heeled shoes that made a koi koi sound when she walked." The other girls nodded in agreement. "Yes, and they say she was very mean," added Kemi, another girl in the group. "She would punish the students harshly for even the smallest mistakes. Everyone was afraid of her." "But one day," Ada continued, her voice growing more dramatic, "something terrible happened. No one knows exactly what, but Miss Koi Koi died. Some say she fell down the stairs, others say it was something more sinister." "Ever since then," Kemi chimed in, "her ghost has haunted the school. Late at night you can hear her high heels clicking down the corridors. Koi 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 Koi! And if you hear that sound too close, you'd better hide, or she might come for you." Neka shivered, clutching her blanket tightly around her. "But why does she haunt the school?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What does she want?" The room fell silent. None of the girls had an answer. The legend of Miss Koi. Koi was a tale of fear, not understanding. The students had always accepted the ghost's presence as a fact of life, a mysterious force that could not be questioned or explained. But unknown to them, the truth behind the haunting was far more complex and far more tragic than they could have imagined. Years before the legend of Miss Koi Koi became a fixture in the minds of St. Catherine's students, there was Miss Adaobi Kalu, a young teacher full of hope and passion. When Miss Adaobi first arrived at St. Catherine's, the school was in a period of transition. The old headmistress had just retired, and Mrs. Ekanem, a stern and uncompromising woman, had taken her place. Miss Adaobi was excited about her new position. She had always dreamed of teaching, of shaping young minds and helping students discover their potential. Her arrival at St. Catherine's felt like the beginning of something wonderful. She was determined to make a difference in the lives of the girls she taught. From the moment she stepped foot on the campus, it was clear that Miss Adaobi was different. She was young, vibrant, and full of life. She dressed elegantly, her clothes always neat and stylish, and her most notable accessory was a pair of red high-heeled shoes that clicked rhythmically as she walked. Koi, 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 koi. The students were immediately drawn to her. Unlike many of the other teachers, who were strict and distant, Miss Adaobi was warm and approachable. She took the time to get to know each of her students, learning their names, their interests, and their struggles. She offered extra help after class, listened to their problems, and provided guidance with a gentle hand. But as much as the students adored her, there was one person who did not, Mrs. Ekanem, the new headmistress. Mrs. Ekanem was a woman who believed in discipline above all else. To her, The school was not just a place of learning, but a place where young girls were molded into proper, obedient women. She saw Miss Adeobi's kindness as a weakness, an approach that would undermine the authority needed to maintain order. "You're too lenient with them," Mrs. Eckenham would often say during staff meetings. "These girls need to learn discipline. They need to understand that life is not about being coddled." Miss Adobe disagreed, but she was careful not to voice her opposition too strongly. She knew that challenging Mrs. Eckenham openly would only lead to conflict, and she did not want to create an atmosphere of tension in the school. Instead, she focused on her work, doing her best to support her students while maintaining the professional respect of her colleagues. As the months passed, Miss Adeobi's popularity among the students grew, but so did the friction between her and Mrs. Eckenham. The headmistress began to scrutinize Miss Adeobi's every move, searching for any excuse to reprimand her. One day, Miss Adeobi stayed late after class to help a student who was struggling with her studies. When Mrs. Eckenham found out, she was furious. "Why are you encouraging these girls to think they deserve special treatment?" Mrs. Eckenham demanded. "They need to learn to stand on their own 2 feet." "I'm simply trying to help them succeed," Miss Adeobi replied calmly. "Isn't that what we're here for?" But Mrs. Eckenham was not convinced. "You're coddling them. You're making them weak." The tension between the two women continued to build, and it soon became clear that something had to give. Miss Adobe was determined to remain true to her principles, but she knew that her position at the school was becoming increasingly precarious. Despite the growing tension with Mrs. Eckenham, Miss Adobe found solace in her work and in the relationship she had built with her students. But there was another source of comfort in her life, one that she kept hidden from everyone else: her relationship with Mr. Olu, the school's sports teacher. Mr. Olu was a handsome and charismatic man, well liked by both the students and the staff. He had a natural talent for working with the girls, encouraging them to push their limits and develop their physical abilities. His passion for sports was matched only by his passion for life, and it wasn't long before he and Miss Adeobi found themselves drawn to each other. Their relationship began innocently enough: friendly conversations during lunch breaks, shared laughter over jokes, and mutual respect for each other's work. But as time passed, their bond deepened, and what had started as a simple friendship blossomed into something more. Miss Adeobi knew the risks. Relationships between staff members were frowned upon, especially by Mrs. Eckenham, who believed that such entanglements distracted from the primary responsibility of educating and disciplining the students. But Miss Adeobi couldn't help how she felt. For the first time since she had arrived at St. Catherine's, she had found someone who understood her, someone who shared her ideals and her passion for teaching. The two began meeting in secret, stealing moments together whenever they could. They would take long walks around the school grounds after the students had gone to bed, talking about their dreams and aspirations. Mr. Olu was a kindred spirit, someone who, like Miss Adeobi, believed that teaching was not just about imparting knowledge, but about nurturing the whole person. But their happiness was short-lived. Rumors began to circulate among the students. They noticed the way Mr. Olu and Miss Adeobi looked at each other, the way they seemed to disappear at the same time, only to return later with smiles on their faces. The whispers grew louder, and it wasn't long before the rumors reached the ears of Mrs. Eckenham. The headmistress was not pleased. She had been looking for a reason to discipline Miss Adeobi, and now she had one. She called Miss Adeobi into her office and confronted her. "Miss Kalu, it has come to my attention that you have been engaging in an inappropriate relationship with Mr. Olu," Mrs. Eckenham said, her voice cold and accusing. Miss Adeobi was taken aback, but tried to remain composed. "I don't see how my personal life is relevant to my work here, Mrs. Eckenham." "It is entirely relevant," the headmistress replied sharply. "Your behavior sets a poor example for the students. We are here to teach them discipline and propriety, not to indulge in romantic entanglements. Miss Adaobi felt a surge of anger, but kept her voice steady. I have always conducted myself with professionalism, and my relationship with Mr. Olu does not interfere with my responsibilities. But Mrs. Eckenham was not interested in explanations. I am warning you, Miss Kalu. If I hear of any more incidents, there will be consequences. The confrontation left Miss Adaobi shaken. She knew that Mrs. Eckenham's threats were not idle. The headmistress held all the power, and there was little Miss Adaobi could do to protect herself if Mrs. Eckenham decided to take action. As she walked back to her classroom, Miss Adaobi felt a sense of foreboding. She knew that things were coming to a head, and that it was only a matter of time before something gave. The weeks following the confrontation with Mrs. Eckenham were tense. Miss Adaobi tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, focusing on her students and her work, but the strain was evident. She was constantly on edge, worried that any small misstep could lead to her downfall. The relationship between her and Mr. Olu became even more secretive. They still met whenever they could, but the joy of their time together was now overshadowed by the fear of being caught. The tension was taking its toll on both of them, but they clung to each other, finding comfort in their shared struggle. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. One evening, after the students had gone to bed, Miss Adaobi received a note from Mr. Olu asking her to meet him in the music room. It was one of their favorite places, a quiet, secluded space where they could be alone, away from the prying eyes of the school. As she made her way to the music room, her red heels clicking softly on the marble floors, Miss Adaobi couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The school was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of the night absent. The corridors, usually bustling with life during the day, felt deserted and oppressive. When she arrived at the music room, she found Mr. Olu waiting for her, his expression tense. "What's wrong?" she asked, her heart pounding in her chest. Mr. Olu hesitated, then took her hand. "Adaobi, I've been thinking, maybe it's time we left this place, together." Miss Adaobi was taken aback. "Leave? But where would we go? What would we do?" "We could start over," Mr. Olu said, his voice filled with determination. "Find another school, another town. We could be together, without all this secrecy." The idea was tempting, but Miss Adaobi hesitated. She loved her job, loved her students, but the constant fear of being discovered, the tension with Mrs. Eckenham, was wearing her down. The thought of leaving it all behind, of starting a new life with Mr. Olu, was appealing. But before she could respond, the door to the music room burst open, and there stood Mrs. Eckenham, her face twisted with anger. "So it's true!" she spat, her voice cold and venomous. "I knew you were up to something. You've brought disgrace to this school, Miss Kalu. And you, Mr. Olu, how dare you? How dare you both?" Miss Adaobi and Mr. Olu stood frozen, caught in the act. There was no way out now. The truth was out, and the consequences would be severe. Mrs. Eckenham turned to Miss Adaobi, her eyes blazing with fury. "You are finished here. Pack your things and leave. You will never work in education again." Miss Adaobi felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She had known this moment might come, but she wasn't prepared for the harshness of it. Her career, her passion, was being ripped away from her. But before she could respond, Mr. Olu stepped forward. "It's not her fault," he said, his voice firm. "I'm the one who pursued her. If you're going to punish anyone, it should be me." Mrs. Eckenham sneered. "You're both to blame, and you will both face the consequences." The tension in the room was unbearable. Miss Adaobi could feel the walls closing in on her. The life she had built, the dreams she had nurtured, were crumbling before her eyes. In a moment of desperation, she turned and fled the room, her red heels echoing down the corridor. Koi koi, koi koi. She ran through the darkened halls, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. But as she reached the top of the staircase leading to her dormitory, her foot slipped. The sound of her fall echoed through the silent school, followed by a sickening thud. When the students found her the next morning, Miss Adaobi was gone. The news of Miss Adaobi's death spread quickly through St. Catherine's, casting a dark shadow over the school. The official story was that she had fallen down the stairs in a tragic accident, but the students whispered of something more sinister. They spoke of the tension between Miss Adaobi and Mrs. Ekanem, of the secret relationship with Mr. Olu, and of the events leading up to that fateful night. The school administration, led by Mrs. Ekanem, tried to move on quickly, sweeping the incident under the rug. But the students could not forget. They had loved Miss Adaobi, and her sudden death left a deep void in their hearts. It wasn't long before strange things began to happen. The first sign was the sound, koi 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 koi. Late at night, when the school was quiet and the students were supposed to be asleep, the unmistakable click of high heels would echo through the dormitory corridors. The girls would lie in their beds, wide-eyed with fear, listening to the ghostly sound. Some would cover their ears, others would whisper prayers, but none dared to investigate. Then came the sightings. Students began to report seeing a figure dressed in red, her face pale and sad, wandering the halls of the school. She would appear at the end of a corridor, only to vanish when someone tried to approach. The figure was always described the same way, elegant, graceful, but with an air of sorrow that chilled the soul. The girls were terrified. They knew deep in their hearts that it was Miss Adaobi, returned from the grave to haunt the school where she had met her tragic end. But why had she come back? What did she want? The administration, particularly Mrs. Ekanem, dismissed the rumors as nonsense. "There is no such thing as ghosts," she would say sternly whenever the subject was brought up. "Miss Kalu's death was a tragic accident, and we must move on." But the students could not be so easily convinced. The sightings continued, and so did the haunting sounds. The girls began to avoid certain areas of the school, particularly at night. They refused to walk alone in the corridors, and the once joyful atmosphere of the dormitories became tense and fearful. One night, a group of girls from Dormitory B decided to take matters into their own hands. They had heard the stories, they had felt the fear, and they were determined to find out the truth. Armed with nothing but their courage and a flashlight, they set out to explore the school after lights out, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ghost. They started in the music room, where Miss Adaobi had often played the piano. The room was dark and empty, the air thick with dust. The girls shone the flashlight around, but there was no sign of anything unusual. "Maybe it's just a story," whispered one of the girls, her voice trembling. But just as they were about to leave, they heard it, the sound of the piano keys being softly played, even though no one was there. The haunting melody filled the room, sending chills down their spines. The girls froze, too terrified to move. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped, and the flashlight flickered. The girls huddled together, their eyes wide with fear. And then they saw her, a faint figure standing by the piano, her red dress glowing faintly in the darkness. It was Miss Adaobi. The girls screamed and fled the room, running back to their dormitory as fast as they could. They didn't stop until they were safely in their beds, the blankets pulled up to their chins. The encounter left them shaken, but it also confirmed what they had suspected all along. Miss Adaobi's spirit was still in the school, and she wasn't resting. The encounter in the music room left the girls of Dormitory B shaken, but it also sparked something else. a determination to uncover the truth behind the haunting. They knew that Miss Adaobi's spirit was restless, but they didn't understand why. And so they decided to investigate further. The group of girls, led by Ada, began to dig into the history of the school. They talked to older students, former staff members, and even some of the town's residents who remembered the events of the past. What they discovered was a story far more complex and tragic than they had imagined. Miss Adaobi Kalu, it seemed, had been more than just a teacher. She had been a woman of deep compassion and kindness, beloved by her students, but misunderstood by the school's administration. The tension between her and Mrs. Eckenham had been well known, as was her secret relationship with Mr. Olu. But there was more, something that had been hidden, something that had led to her untimely death. Through their conversations, the girls learned that Miss Adaobi had been planning to leave the school, not just because of the tension with Mrs. Eckenham, but because she had discovered something disturbing. According to the accounts they gathered, Miss Adaobi had uncovered evidence of corruption within the school's administration, funds that had been embezzled, students who had been mistreated, and secrets that were meant to stay buried. Miss Adaobi, ever the idealist, had confronted Mrs. Eckenham with her findings, demanding that the wrongs be righted. But instead of addressing the issues, Mrs. Eckenham had silenced her, threatening to ruin her career if she spoke out. The girls realized that Miss Adaobi's fall down the stairs might not have been an accident after all. The circumstances surrounding her death were suspicious, and there were those who believed that she had been pushed, or at the very least, that she had been driven to desperation by the pressure and threats from the administration. As they pieced together the story, the girls felt a growing sense of injustice. Miss Adaobi had been wronged, her life cut short because she had dared to stand up for what was right. And now, her spirit was trapped, unable to move on because the truth had never been revealed. "We have to do something," Ada said, her voice firm with resolve. "We can't let her suffer like this. We have to let everyone know what really happened." But how? The administration was still in power, and Mrs. Eckenham was not someone who would take kindly to a group of students challenging her authority. The girls knew they had to be careful, but they also knew they couldn't let fear stop them. They decided to start by gathering evidence. They searched the school records, looked for old letters, and talked to anyone who might have known Miss Adaobi. They also began documenting their own experiences with the haunting, hoping to build a case that would prove Miss Adaobi's presence was more than just a ghost story. As they delved deeper, they discovered more about Miss Adaobi's life, her dreams, her hopes, and her unwavering commitment to her students. The more they learned, the more they realized how much she had meant to the school, and how much had been lost with her death. The girls felt a growing sense of responsibility. They knew that they were the only ones who could set things right, the only ones who could give Miss Adaobi the peace she deserved. The girls continued their investigation, gathering evidence and piecing together the story of Miss Adaobi's life and death. But they knew that to truly understand her, they needed to confront the ghost herself. They needed to find a way to communicate with Miss Koi Koi, to hear her side of the story and understand what she wanted. It was a risky plan, and they knew it, but they also knew that it was the only way to bring closure to the haunting. One night, the group of girls gathered in the music room, the place where Miss Adaobi had spent so many hours playing the piano. They brought candles, set them in a circle around the room, and sat in the center, holding hands. The atmosphere was tense, filled with a mix of fear and determination. "We're here to help you, Miss Adaobi," Ada said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "We want to know your story. We want to understand why you're still here." The room was silent, save for the soft flicker of the candle flames. The girls waited, their hearts pounding in their chests. For a long moment, nothing happened. But then, slowly, they began to hear it. The sound of high heels clicking softly on the floor. Koi, 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 koi. The temperature in the room dropped, and a faint mist began to form near the piano. The girls watched in awe and fear as the mist slowly took shape, forming into the figure of a woman dressed in red. It was Miss Adaobi. Her face was pale and sad, her eyes filled with a deep sorrow. She looked at the girls, her expression both grateful and mournful. "Why are you here?" Ada asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Adaobi didn't speak, but the girls felt her presence, her emotions, filling the room. They could feel her pain, her longing for justice, and her desire to protect the students she had loved so dearly. Suddenly, the room filled with a series of images, flashes of memory that the girls could see in their minds. They saw Miss Adaobi confronting Mrs. Ekanem, the threats, the fear, and the moments leading up to her fall down the stairs. They saw her love for Mr. Olu, her passion for teaching, and her dedication to the students. And then, they saw her death, the fall, the terror, the final moments of her life as she lay at the bottom of the stairs, alone and afraid. The images were overwhelming, and the girls felt tears streaming down their faces. They understood now. Miss Adaobi had returned not to seek revenge, but to seek justice. She wanted the truth to be known, to ensure that what had happened to her would never happen to anyone else. "We will tell your story," Ada promised, her voice choked with emotion. "We will make sure everyone knows the truth." Miss Adaobi's expression softened, a faint smile appearing on her lips. The mist around her began to dissipate, and the room slowly returned to normal. The girls knew that they had made contact, that they had heard Miss Adaobi's message. But their work was not yet done. The next day, the girls put their plan into action. Armed with the evidence they had gathered and the knowledge they had gained from their encounter with Miss Adaobi, they approached the school administration. They knew it was a bold move, but they were determined to bring the truth to light. At first, Mrs. Ekanem dismissed their claims, accusing them of fabricating stories and spreading rumors. But the girls were persistent. They presented the evidence they had collected, the letters, the documents, and the testimonies from former staff members. They also shared their own experiences with the haunting, describing the encounter in the music room in detail. The administration was skeptical, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. Mrs. Ekanem, faced with the truth, had no choice but to acknowledge what had happened. The story of Miss Adaobi Kalu was finally revealed to the entire school. The students learned about her life, her dedication to teaching, and the injustice that had led to her death. They learned about the corruption within the administration and the cover-up that had followed. But most importantly, they learned about the message Miss Adaobi had left behind, a message of kindness, justice, and the importance of standing up for what is right. The school administration took immediate action. Mrs. Ekanem was removed from her position, and a new head mistress was appointed. The school's policies were reviewed and reformed, with a focus on creating a more supportive and compassionate environment for both students and staff. As for the girls who had uncovered the truth, they were celebrated as heroes. Their bravery and determination had not only brought justice to Miss Adaobi, but had also changed the culture of the school for the better. And what of Miss Koi Koi? After the truth was revealed, the haunting stopped. The sounds of high heels clicking in the night, the ghostly figure in the red dress, these all faded away. But the memory of Miss Adaobi remained, her legacy living on in the hearts of the students she had cared for so deeply. The girls of St. Catherine's knew that they would never forget her, and they made a vow to honor her memory by living up to the values she had embodied: kindness, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what is right. They also knew that if only others had known the truth sooner, if only they had understood why Miss Koi Koi haunted the school, things might have been different. But in the end, they had done what they could to set things right, and they took comfort in knowing that Miss Adeobi's spirit was finally at peace. As the years passed, the story of Miss Koi Koi became less of a ghost story and more of a lesson, a reminder to future generations of students that the truth always matters and that the fight for justice is never in vain. And so, the legend of Miss Koi Koi lived on, not as a tale of fear, but as a symbol of hope